The dog didn't bark. He simply knocked. Retired Navy SEAL Ethan Walker opened the door and found a starving German shepherd shivering in the snow. Ethan didn't know the old tag around its neck carried a forgotten veteran's secret. He only knew one thing: no warrior gets left behind. Winter had settled heavily over Silver Creek, Montana. Snow drifted through the pine, covered mountains like silent ghosts, softening the world beneath a blanket of white. The roads leading into town were nearly empty, and the forests surrounding the valley seemed endless beneath the gray sky. At the edge of those woods stood a weathered log cabin where Ethan Walker lived alone. Ethan was 48 years old, a retired Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, rough hands, and the solid build of a man who had spent most of his life carrying responsibilities heavier than himself. His dark blonde hair was beginning to gray around the temples, and a thin scar crossed his jawline, a souvenir from a mission years ago. Most people in Silver Creek respected him, but very few truly knew him. Ethan preferred it that way. Solitude was easier than explaining the things he carried inside. The cabin reflected its owner. Everything had a place. Firewood stacked neatly by the wall, boots lined up beside the door, the kitchen spotless. Yet despite the order, the place felt empty. The silence inside often seemed louder than any battlefield Ethan had ever crossed. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a framed photograph. Ethan tried not to look at it often, but some nights he failed. The photograph showed two younger men standing in desert camouflage uniforms. One was Ethan, the other was Michael Reed. Michael had been 32 when he died, tall, athletic, with sandy brown hair and warm green eyes that always seemed to be smiling. Unlike Ethan's quiet nature, Michael could make friends anywhere. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, told terrible jokes, and somehow managed to keep morale alive even during the darkest missions. Years earlier, during an operation in Afghanistan, everything had gone wrong in less than a minute. Ethan remembered every detail: the dust, the gunfire, the confusion. Most of all, he remembered the moment Michael fell. Ethan had survived. Michael had not. The military called it unavoidable. Ethan never agreed. Every winter, the memory returned, like a storm that refused to move on. Tonight was no different. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls. Snow swirled through the darkness. Ethan sat beside the fireplace holding a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He stared into the flames, trying unsuccessfully. Then came the sound. Knock. 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 Ethan frowned. He glanced toward the front door. At first he assumed a loose branch had struck the porch. The storm was growing stronger. He returned his attention to the fire. Then it came again. Knock. 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 This time the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, controlled. Ethan slowly stood. Years of military training had never fully left him. He moved quietly toward the door and listened. Wind, snow, silence. Then another knock. A flash of reflected snowlight revealed a figure standing on the porch. It was a dog, a German shepherd. Ethan immediately noticed how thin the animal looked. The dog appeared to be around 8 years old. His black and tan coat was matted with snow and ice. His ribs were visible beneath his fur. One front paw rested awkwardly against the wooden boards as though it had been injured long ago. Yet despite his condition, there was something remarkable about him. His posture remained proud, alert, disciplined. His amber eyes watched the cabin with unwavering focus. Ethan had seen military working dogs before. This dog carried himself like one. He opened the door, freezing air rushed inside. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not whine. He did not try to force his way into the cabin. Instead, he stood perfectly still and stared directly at Ethan. "Easy, boy," Ethan said quietly. The dog tilted his head slightly. Ethan crouched down and examined him more closely. Around the dog's neck hung an old leather collar. The leather was cracked from age and weather. Attached to it was a worn metal tag scratched by years of use. Ethan brushed away some snow and read the engraving. Return to Frank Dawson. He read it again. Return to Frank Dawson. The name meant nothing to him. Yet the message felt strangely important. The dog watched him carefully, almost as if waiting for recognition. Frank Dawson? Ethan muttered. Who are you? The German shepherd lowered his head briefly before looking past Ethan into the cabin. Ethan stepped aside. Come on. The dog entered slowly. Even exhausted, he moved with remarkable caution. He checked the room before settling near the fireplace. Ethan fetched a bowl of water and leftover chicken from the refrigerator. Most starving dogs would have attacked the food immediately. This one didn't. The shepherd glanced at the meal, then toward the front door. Only after several seconds did he begin eating. Even then he stopped repeatedly to look outside through the window. Ethan found himself watching the animal with growing curiosity. Something wasn't right. The dog behaved less like a stray, and more like someone trying to complete a mission. While the shepherd ate, Ethan gently inspected him. Numerous scars marked his body. An old wound on his shoulder had healed years ago. Another scar crossed his hind leg. These were not the injuries of an ordinary pet. Whoever Shadow had been, life had tested him repeatedly. After finishing part of the meal, the dog stood and limped toward the door. He stared outside. Ethan checked the storm. Visibility was terrible. Snow blew across the forest beyond the cabin. You're not going anywhere tonight, Ethan said. The dog looked back at him, then returned his attention to the woods. The movement stirred something uncomfortable inside Ethan. It reminded him of Michael. During missions, Michael had always looked back the same way before entering danger, silently asking Ethan if he was ready. Ethan clenched his jaw. He hated when memories ambushed him without warning. The dog paced once near the entrance. Then he returned to the door and sat facing the storm. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Yet Shadow never relaxed. Ethan finally gave him a name. Shadow. It seemed appropriate. The dog carried himself like a ghost from another life. Several times, Ethan tried encouraging him toward the warmth of the fire. Each time Shadow returned to the same spot beside the door, watching, waiting, listening as the storm deepened outside. Ethan noticed something else. Whenever the wind shifted from the direction of the forest, Shadow became visibly tense. His ears lifted, his breathing changed. His eyes fixed on the distant tree line beyond the snow-covered clearing. Whatever had brought him here was still out there. Ethan walked to the window and followed the dog's gaze. Nothing but darkness and endless trees. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere beyond those woods, someone needed help. Shadow suddenly stood and released a low, desperate whine. Not a cry for food. Not fear. It sounded like urgency, like a warning. He placed one paw against the door and looked directly at Ethan. Then back toward the forest. Then at Ethan again. The message was becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan felt an old sensation stirring deep inside him. Purpose. It had been years since he had felt, years since someone needed him for something greater than surviving another lonely winter. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the German shepherd remained fixed on the forest, his amber eyes filled with determination and worry. Whatever waited beyond those trees mattered enough for an old wounded dog to cross miles of wilderness and a deadly storm. Shadow sat beside the door and stared into the darkness once more, as though pleading with Ethan to understand. The storm had not completely passed. By the time dawn, colored light filtered through the clouds above Silver Creek. The mountains were still wrapped in snow and silence. Wind drifted through the pine trees in long, mournful whispers, and the forest seemed larger than usual, as if the storm had pushed the world farther apart during the night. Ethan Walker stood near the cabin window with a heavy coat pulled over his shoulders. Across the room, Shadow sat beside the front door, exactly where he had spent most of the night. The old German shepherd looked exhausted, His injured leg trembled slightly from time to time, and the fur around his muzzle carried streaks of gray that revealed his age. Yet there was nothing tired about his eyes. They remained fixed on the forest, waiting, watching. Ethan had seen that expression before in soldiers preparing for a mission. The dog was trying to tell him something. Finally, Ethan grabbed his truck keys. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what's so important out there." Shadow stood immediately, his ears lifted. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the dog seemed relieved. 30 minutes later, Ethan's pickup moved slowly along an old logging road buried beneath fresh snow. Shadow sat in the passenger seat staring ahead. Whenever the truck approached an intersection or fork in the road, the dog became visibly alert. Twice he barked sharply, causing Ethan to turn onto narrower trails leading deeper into the mountains. The farther they traveled, the more isolated the landscape became. Eventually the road disappeared altogether. Ethan parked near a cluster of pines and stepped outside. Cold air bit through his jacket. Shadow jumped down and immediately began moving toward the woods. Ethan followed. The dog limped but never hesitated. It was as though he knew exactly where he was going. Nearly 20 minutes later, the trees opened into a small clearing hidden among the mountains. There stood an old cabin. The structure looked forgotten by time. Its roof sagged beneath the weight of snow. One shutter hung crooked beside a frost-covered window. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Even from a distance, Ethan could tell nobody had maintained the place for years. Shadow suddenly broke into a faster pace. A low whine escaped his throat. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Something was wrong. He pushed through the snow toward the cabin and reached the front porch. The door stood partially open inside. The air felt cold and still. "Hello?" Ethan called. No answer. Shadow rushed past him. The dog crossed the room and stopped beside a fallen figure lying near a wood stove. Ethan hurried forward. An elderly man was trapped beneath part of a collapsed shelf. He appeared thin and fragile, perhaps 78 years old. His white hair had grown long and uneven. Deep lines marked his weathered face. Despite his age, Ethan could see traces of strength that had once defined him. The man's hands were rough with old scars, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working hard. "Sir." Ethan knelt beside him. The old man's eyes fluttered open. They were pale blue and clouded with exhaustion. "Thought," the man whispered weakly, "thought I was done for." Ethan carefully lifted the broken shelf away. "Not today." The man attempted a faint smile before losing consciousness again. Shadow remained beside him, whining softly. Ethan immediately understood. The dog hadn't come looking for help for himself. He had come for this man. It took nearly an hour to carry the old man to the truck and navigate the snowy roads back toward town. During the drive, Ethan glanced repeatedly at the rearview mirror. The elderly man remained unconscious but breathing steadily. Shadow refused to leave his side. The German shepherd stretched across the back seat, keeping his head pressed against the man's arm. It was the first time Ethan had seen the dog truly relax. Silver Creek Community Hospital was small but efficient. The building sat near the edge of town beside a frozen creek. Nurses quickly wheeled the old man inside. Among them was Rebecca Lawson, a nurse in her early 40s with short brown hair and kind eyes. Rebecca had spent years caring for elderly patients after losing her own father to illness. The experience had made her patient and compassionate toward people who felt forgotten by the world. After checking the man's identification, she approached Ethan. "His name is Frank Dawson," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. The name was on Shadow's collar. Rebecca looked toward the dog. "Shadow." Ethan explained everything. By evening, doctors confirmed that Frank had suffered dehydration, exhaustion, and a minor fracture in his hip after falling during the storm. Fortunately, he had been found in time. Had another day passed, he might not have survived. Ethan remained at the hospital longer than he intended. Something about the situation bothered him. Who was Frank Dawson? Why was he living alone in a collapsing cabin hidden deep in the mountains? And how had Shadow known exactly where to find help? The answers came from an unexpected source. Later that evening, Rebecca returned carrying a folder recovered from Frank's belongings. "You should probably know this," she said. Inside were documents from a Veterans Assistance Program. Ethan read carefully. Years earlier, Frank Dawson had served during the Gulf War. After retirement, he struggled with PTSD and survivor's guilt. Rather than withdrawing completely, he eventually joined a nonprofit organization that paired veterans with service dogs. The program helped former soldiers rebuild trust and connection. Frank had become one of their volunteer trainers, and according to the records, one of his dogs had been Shadow. Ethan looked through several old photographs. In one image, a younger Frank stood beside a healthy German shepherd. The dog's ears stood proudly upright. His coat gleamed in the sunlight. The bond between them was obvious. Another photograph showed Frank surrounded by several veterans during a therapy session. Many smiled for what looked like the first time in years. Ethan found himself unexpectedly moved. Frank had spent his later years helping broken soldiers find their way back into life. Yet somehow, he had ended up forgotten in an isolated cabin. That night, Ethan sat outside the hospital with a cup of coffee. Snow drifted lazily through the parking lot. Beside him, Shadow lay quietly on the pavement. For the first time since meeting the dog, Ethan reached down and gently scratched behind his ears. Shadow closed his eyes briefly. "You never gave up on him, did you?" Ethan asked. The dog lifted his head. Hours later, Frank finally woke. Ethan happened to be standing near the doorway when the old veteran slowly opened his eyes. Confusion crossed his face at first. Then he looked around the room. His gaze landed on Ethan. "Hospital?" he asked. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "You took a bad fall." Frank nodded weakly. Then something caught his attention near the foot of the bed. Shadow had quietly entered the room after slipping away from the waiting area. The old German shepherd stood frozen. Frank stared at him. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the old man's face began to tremble. His eyes widened. Tears instantly filled them. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog crossed the room. Frank reached out, shaking hands. The German shepherd pressed his head against the old veteran's chest. A broken sob escaped Frank's throat. "Shadow," he repeated. "My boy." Tears rolled freely down his weathered cheeks. 2 years earlier, Shadow had disappeared during a mountain hike. After chasing something into the woods, search teams had looked for weeks. Frank eventually believed the dog had died somewhere in the wilderness. Yet here he was, alive, older, scarred, but home. Frank wrapped both arms around the dog and cried openly. For the first time since Ethan had met him, Shadow finally looked at peace. Spring had not yet arrived in Silver Creek. The snow that covered the mountains had begun to soften beneath occasional sunlight, but patches of ice still clung stubbornly to the roads and pine-covered hills. The air carried that strange feeling that comes between seasons, when winter is weakening but refuses to surrender completely. 3 days had passed since Frank Dawson had been discharged from the hospital. Ethan Walker now spent much of his time helping the elderly veteran recover. The old cabin hidden in the forest needed repairs after years of neglect and damage from the recent storm. Frank insisted he could manage on his own, but Ethan ignored those protests. Deep down, both men understood that neither of them truly wanted to be alone anymore. That particular morning, Ethan stood on a ladder repairing a section of the ceiling, while Frank sat near the wood stove drinking coffee. Shadow lay stretched across a faded rug nearby. The old German shepherd already looked healthier. His ribs were still visible, but his coat had regained some shine, and his eyes no longer carried the same desperate exhaustion Ethan had seen the night the dog appeared at his door. Shadow occasionally lifted his head to watch Frank, as though making sure the old veteran had not vanished again. Frank noticed and smiled every time. "He's still checking on me," Frank said quietly. Ethan glanced down. "Looks like he's making up for lost time." Frank nodded. Shadow always did take his responsibilities too seriously. For a moment his expression softened with memory. The old veteran rarely spoke much about the years before his retirement, but when he mentioned Shadow, his voice always changed. There was warmth there. Gratitude. The kind of affection usually reserved for family. Later that afternoon, Ethan moved into the small bedroom to repair loose floorboards beneath the bed. The room was simple. A narrow wooden bed stood beside a dusty nightstand. Old military photographs hung on one wall. Most showed young men smiling beside helicopters, armored vehicles, or desert camps. The photographs had faded over the years, but Frank had clearly preserved them carefully. Ethan pushed the bed aside. As he examined the damaged boards, his boot struck something metallic hidden beneath the frame. A dull clang echoed through the room. He crouched down and reached into the shadows. His fingers brushed cold steel. Pulling harder, he dragged out a small iron box coated in dust. The box was old, perhaps decades old. Rust marked the corners. A heavy latch secured the front. Ethan stared at it for a moment before carrying it into the main room. Frank immediately froze when he saw it. The coffee cup in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. "Where did you find that?" he asked. Ethan noticed something unusual in the old man's voice. Fear, under the bed. Frank slowly set the cup down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he motioned toward the table. "Bring it here." Ethan placed the box carefully on the wooden surface. Frank rested one trembling hand on the lid. His eyes remained fixed on the metal as though looking through time itself. Eventually he opened the latch. Inside were dozens of folders, photographs, military reports, newspaper clippings, maps, and several military identification cards. Everything had been organized with remarkable precision. Ethan lifted one file. The date printed across the top immediately caught his attention. 1991. Another file contained photographs taken somewhere in the Middle East. Several soldiers appeared in the images. Others showed helicopters and damaged buildings. One black and white picture featured a younger Frank standing beside a rescue helicopter. He looked almost unrecognizable, strong, confident, proud. "What is all this?" Ethan asked quietly. Frank leaned back in his chair. The lines on his face suddenly seemed deeper. A story nobody wanted remembered. Ethan remained silent. He had learned long ago that some stories only emerged when allowed to do so at their own pace. After a long pause, Frank began speaking. During the Gulf War, he had served as part of a special rescue unit responsible for extracting isolated personnel, trapped behind dangerous front lines. Most missions remained classified for years. Some were never discussed publicly at all. But one mission had changed everything. According to Frank, a transport helicopter carrying humanitarian workers and military advisors crashed deep inside hostile territory. Official reports later claimed the passengers died before rescue teams arrived. The government closed the case within weeks. But that wasn't what happened. Frank revealed that a small rescue team had secretly located survivors and extracted them during an operation so dangerous that several military leaders later refused to acknowledge it publicly. The political climate at the time made the situation complicated. Documents disappeared. Reports were altered. Credit went elsewhere. The survivors lived, but the truth slowly vanished beneath layers of bureaucracy. "We saved 23 people," Frank said softly. 23 families got their loved ones back." Ethan studied him. "Then why hide it?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Sometimes people care more about protecting careers than protecting truth." Silence filled the room. Ethan looked through another folder. Inside were signed statements, mission maps, and photographs supporting Frank's story. Whoever assembled this collection had spent years preserving evidence. Frank sighed. "I kept everything because one day I thought someone might ask what really happened." Before Ethan could respond, a truck pulled into the driveway outside. Shadow immediately stood. A moment later, a woman stepped through the front door carrying a veterinary bag. Emily Carter smiled when she entered. Emily was 39 years old, with shoulder, length brown hair usually tied into a practical ponytail. She had spent years working as a veterinarian throughout rural Montana. Losing a beloved horse as a teenager had inspired her career and taught her how deeply animals could affect people's lives. Unlike many professionals, Emily never treated animals as property. She treated them as companions. "I heard my favorite patient is avoiding follow-up appointments," she teased. Shadow immediately approached her. Ethan noticed the dog's tail move slightly. Emily crouched beside him and checked his injured leg. "You're improving," she said, "though you're still stubborn." Shadow licked her hand once. Frank chuckled softly. "He's always been stubborn." Emily spent nearly an hour examining the dog. During that time, she and Ethan spoke more than they ever had before. What began as polite conversation gradually became easier. They discovered shared interests, exchanged stories about small-town life, and occasionally laughed. Frank watched the interaction from across the room with quiet amusement. It was the first time he had seen Ethan genuinely relaxed around another person in years. As evening approached, Emily finally prepared to leave. Before she did, Ethan carefully returned the documents to the iron box. Frank watched every movement. When the last folder disappeared inside, the old veteran seemed relieved. After dinner, Ethan carried the box back toward the bedroom. A few minutes later, Frank entered the room intending to double-check its contents. Suddenly, Ethan heard a sharp intake of breath. He turned. Frank stood frozen beside the bed. His face had gone pale. "No," the old man whispered. Ethan stepped closer. Several folders remained inside the box: maps, reports, photographs. Yet one section sat completely empty. Frank dropped to his knees beside the iron box. His hands shook visibly as he searched through the contents again and again. "It's gone," he said. "What is?" Ethan asked. Frank looked up. Fear filled his eyes. The kind of fear that came not from age, but from memory. "The rescue file," he whispered. "The original mission file. The most important one." Ethan felt a chill unrelated to the weather outside. Someone had taken it. A pale sun hung above the mountains of Silver Creek, casting long shadows across the snow-covered hills. Winter was slowly loosening its grip, but cold winds still swept through the valleys and forests. The Dawson cabin sat quietly among the towering pines, looking almost peaceful from the outside. Inside, however, tension lingered like an invisible storm. The missing rescue file had changed everything. Ethan Walker had spent most of the previous night searching every corner of the cabin. He checked closets, shelves, storage boxes, and even loose floorboards. Nothing. The folder containing the original records of Frank Dawson's rescue mission had vanished completely. Frank sat near the fireplace, staring into the flames. The old veteran looked older than he had only days before. His shoulders seemed heavier. His hands trembled slightly as he held a faded photograph recovered from the iron box. Shadow rested beside his chair, keeping watch over him as if sensing the weight pressing on the old man's heart. Ethan walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Frank and sat across from him. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "I never wanted any medals," he said quietly. "That's not why I kept those records." Ethan waited. "Then why?" His voice grew distant. "Most people think heroes are the ones who get photographed, the ones standing behind podiums. But that isn't always how it works." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that better than most. Frank took a long breath before continuing. More than 30 years earlier, during the Gulf War, Frank had served under a senior officer named Colonel Richard Halstead. At the time, Halstead was considered a rising star within the military. Charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious, he knew how to impress superiors. But behind closed doors, things were different. According to Frank, Halstead often prioritized his career over the safety of the men under his command. During the rescue operation that Frank had mentioned earlier, Halstead refused to authorize extraction because the mission was considered too dangerous. Yet Frank and a small group of volunteers went anyway. They located the survivors, evacuated 23 civilians and soldiers, and brought everyone home alive. The operation should have become one of the most celebrated rescue missions of the conflict. Instead, Frank returned to discover that the official reports had been rewritten. The mission was credited almost entirely to Halstead. Key witness statements disappeared. Several supporting officers were reassigned. Frank and the others were ordered to remain silent. "We argued," Frank said. "Some of us tried to fight it. But back then, nobody listened to sergeants. Especially not when a colonel wanted a different version of events." Ethan felt anger building inside him. The story reminded him of men he had encountered throughout his own military career. Good soldiers sometimes spent years cleaning up the damage left behind by ambitious leaders. Frank stared down at the coffee in his hands. The missing file contained original mission reports, signatures, witness accounts, everything. "Enough to prove what really happened?" Ethan asked. Frank nodded. "Enough to restore some names." Before Ethan could respond, Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. The dog remained alert for several seconds before settling again. Ethan noticed the reaction but dismissed it. The old German Shepherd had become increasingly protective since Frank returned from the hospital. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove Shadow into town for a follow-up appointment with Emily Carter. The veterinary clinic sat near the edge of Silver Creek, beside a small feed store. Emily greeted them with a smile. Over the past week, Ethan had begun looking forward to these visits more than he cared to admit. Emily possessed a calm confidence that made people comfortable around her. Years of treating injured animals and worried owners had given her unusual patience. After leading Shadow into the examination room, Emily carefully checked his leg and shoulder. As she worked, her expression gradually changed. "Something bothering you?" Ethan asked. Emily ran her fingers gently through the dog's fur near his neck. "Actually, yes." She pointed toward a series of faint scars hidden beneath Shadow's coat. These weren't caused by accidents. Ethan moved closer. Several thin marks crossed the dog's skin. Others circled portions of his neck and chest. "What do they mean?" Emily hesitated. "It looks like he was restrained for long periods." Ethan frowned. "Restrained, possibly chained, or confined somewhere small." She examined another scar near the shoulder. "Some of these injuries are old, maybe a year or two. Others healed much earlier." Shadow remained perfectly still during the examination. Emily sighed softly. "Whatever happened to him, it wasn't recent." Ethan looked down at the dog. The discovery raised even more questions. Frank believed Shadow had disappeared during a hike 2 years earlier. But these scars suggested the dog had spent at least part of that time in captivity. Someone had held him. Somewhere. The thought unsettled Ethan. Emily finished the examination and handed him a treatment schedule. "Physically, he's improving." She paused. "Emotionally, though, animals remember more than people realize." Ethan looked at Shadow again. The dog stared toward the clinic window, as though watching something beyond it. On the drive back to the cabin, neither Ethan nor Shadow seemed interested in conversation. Snow clouds gathered above the mountains once more. By evening, the sky had turned gray. Frank appeared stronger than before, but the missing file continued to weigh heavily on him. After dinner, Ethan helped organize the remaining documents from the iron box. Among the papers, they found additional names connected to the rescue mission. One belonged to a former helicopter pilot named Walter Pierce. Another belonged to a communications officer named James Rutledge. Both men were reportedly still alive. For the first time since the file disappeared, Frank showed a small spark of hope. "Maybe they remember," he said. "Maybe they still have copies." Ethan agreed. They would begin searching soon. Night settled over the mountains. The forest outside grew silent. Around midnight, Shadow suddenly stood from his spot beside the fireplace. His body became rigid. The old German Shepherd walked slowly toward the front window. Ethan noticed immediately. Years of military service had taught him to trust unusual behavior. "What is it?" he asked. Shadow stared through the glass. A low growl emerged from his throat. Ethan stepped closer. At first he saw nothing. Then movement appeared between the trees. Headlights far beyond the property line, partially hidden behind snow. Covered pines, sat a dark SUV. The vehicle remained motionless. No lights except the engine's faint glow. No attempt to approach, just watching. Ethan's instincts activated instantly. He moved closer to the window without turning on additional lights. The SUV remained there for several seconds, then slowly reversed and disappeared into the darkness. Behind him, Frank had risen from his chair. The old veteran looked pale. "Did you see who it was?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. Shadow continued staring at the forest, long after the vehicle vanished. For the first time, Ethan realized something important. The missing file might not have disappeared accidentally. Someone else knew about it. Someone was watching. The weather over Silver Creek had begun to change. The heavy snowstorms that had dominated the mountains for months were slowly giving way to cold rain and patches of muddy earth. Water dripped from the roofs of cabins and barns throughout the valley, and streams hidden beneath the snow began to reappear. Yet for Ethan Walker, the feeling of uncertainty only seemed to deepen. Since discovering that the rescue file had disappeared from Frank Dawson's iron box, he could not shake the feeling that someone was always one step ahead of them. The dark SUV seen near the cabin had vanished without explanation. No license plate, no witnesses, only questions. Ethan spent the next several days investigating every lead he could find. One afternoon he visited the county records office located inside an old brick building near the courthouse. There he met Harold Benton, a retired clerk in his late 60s who worked part-time organizing historical property documents. Harold was a quiet man with thinning gray hair and thick glasses. Years ago he had survived a serious car accident that left him walking with a slight limp, and since then he had developed a habit of noticing details most people overlooked. Ethan showed him several names from the remaining documents recovered from Frank's box. Harold spent nearly an hour searching through old records before finally pulling out a thin file. "This might interest you," he said. Inside was information connected to several business acquisitions throughout Montana. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Coleman. Ethan had heard the name before. Wealthy developer-investor, owner of construction companies across several states. What caught Ethan's attention was another name listed on an older legal document: Richard Halstead. The same surname Frank had mentioned. Ethan requested additional records and eventually found the connection. Richard Coleman was the only son of Colonel Richard Halstead. Ethan sat motionless for several seconds. The realization settled heavily in his chest. The man whose father had allegedly stolen credit for the rescue mission now controlled millions of dollars and possessed enough influence to make problems disappear. Suddenly the missing file seemed far less mysterious. When Ethan returned to the cabin, Frank sat outside watching Shadow wander through the trees. The old German shepherd looked stronger each day. His coat had regained much of its former shine. And although he still limped slightly, there was renewed energy in his movements. Yet sometimes Ethan noticed something strange. Shadow would stop suddenly and stare toward the distant hills as though remembering a place nobody else could see. Ethan handed Frank the documents. The old veteran read them slowly. His jaw tightened. "Coleman," he muttered. "I remember hearing that name years ago. He's Halstead's son." Frank closed his eyes for a moment. Ethan thought the old man might be angry. Instead, he looked tired. "Then this isn't about me anymore," Frank said quietly. "It's about protecting his father's legacy." Ethan sat beside him. "You think he's behind the missing file?" Frank nodded. "If those records ever become public, people will start asking questions. Questions that could destroy everything his father built." Silence settled between them. Eventually Frank stood and looked toward the valley. "Come with me tomorrow." "Where?" Ethan asked. "The Veterans Center." The next day they traveled into town together. The Silver Creek Veterans Center occupied a renovated church that had served generations of soldiers returning home from different wars. Every Thursday evening, local veterans gathered there to share meals, stories, and support. Frank had avoided the place for years, too many memories, too much pain. But something had changed since Shadow returned. For the first time in decades, he seemed ready to speak. Around 20 veterans sat inside the main hall. Some were elderly, others were barely 30. Among them was Daniel Mercer, a former Army medic in his early 30s. Daniel had served overseas before losing 2 close friends during an attack. The experience left him struggling with anxiety and guilt, which was why he rarely spoke during group meetings. Another attendee was Lucas Grant, a former Marine Corps sergeant, who carried a permanent shoulder injury from combat. Though physically strong, Lucas often felt disconnected from civilian life. Frank stood before them holding an old photograph from the Gulf War. At first his voice trembled. Then the words began flowing more naturally. He spoke about fear, about responsibility, about young soldiers trying to protect one another under impossible circumstances. He told stories that had never appeared in newspapers. Stories about courage, mistakes, friendship, and sacrifice. The room remained silent as he spoke. Several younger veterans leaned forward, listening carefully. Daniel Mercer eventually asked a question about survivors' guilt. Frank paused before answering. "The hardest thing isn't surviving," he said. "It's accepting that you survived when others didn't." Ethan felt the words strike deeper than he expected. Instantly he thought of Michael Reed. Even after all these years, that wound remained open. Across the room, Shadow lay quietly near Frank's chair. The old dog seemed unusually calm. Several veterans approached him during the meeting. He accepted every pat and scratch with patient dignity. More than once, Ethan noticed men smiling after interacting with the dog. It reminded him of the stories Frank had told about the PTSD support program. Shadow had always been helping people long before Ethan met him. After the meeting ended, Frank appeared lighter somehow. The burden he had carried alone for decades seemed slightly easier to bear now that others knew the truth. As darkness settled over Silver Creek, Ethan, Frank, and Shadow returned to the cabin. The road wound through forests illuminated by moonlight, reflecting off patches of remaining snow. Halfway home, Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Ethan noticed immediately. The dog's ears stood erect. His body became tense. "What is it?" Frank asked. Shadow moved closer to the window. He sniffed repeatedly, then released a low growl. Ethan slowed the truck. The dog was focused on something outside. They continued driving. A mile later, Shadow became even more agitated. Without warning, he barked sharply and pressed against the passenger side door. Ethan stopped the vehicle. The old German shepherd jumped out before either man could react. "Shadow," Frank called. But the dog ignored him. He raced toward a narrow trail disappearing into the forest. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and followed. Frank remained behind due to his injured hip. The trail wound between dense pines. Shadow moved with surprising determination despite his age. Nearly 15 minutes later, he stopped beside a rocky hillside hidden deep among the trees. There, partially concealed beneath overgrown brush and fallen branches, stood an old metal door built directly into the hillside. Ethan stared. The structure looked abandoned. Rust streaked the hinges, yet the place clearly had not formed naturally. Someone had built it. Shadow approached the door and began sniffing intensely around its base. Then he scratched at the metal. Ethan's pulse quickened. He shined the flashlight across the entrance. There were faint tire tracks nearby, recent ones. Someone had visited this place not long ago. When Ethan and Shadow finally returned to the truck, Frank's face turned pale the moment he saw the direction they had come from.
"Where did he take you?" the old veteran asked. Ethan described the hidden structure. Frank remained silent for several seconds. Then he whispered words Ethan never expected to hear. "That's impossible. You know the place?" Frank looked toward the dark forest. Fear and disbelief mixed in his eyes. "I haven't been there in more than 30 years.
The mountains surrounding Silver Creek stood silent beneath a gray morning sky. Thin layers of fog drifted through the pine forests, while melting snow trickled down rocky slopes in narrow streams. The world seemed calm, but Ethan Walker could not shake the feeling that they had crossed an invisible line. The hidden metal door Shadow had discovered the previous evening was no coincidence. Whatever waited behind it had been buried for decades, and Frank Dawson's reaction proved it mattered far more than anyone had imagined. After a restless night, Ethan loaded supplies into his truck before sunrise. Frank insisted on coming despite the lingering pain in his hip. The old veteran appeared unusually tense. Shadow paced around the vehicle as if impatient for them to leave. The German shepherd had barely slept. Every few minutes he would walk to the cabin door and stare toward the forest. Even Ethan noticed the determination in the dog's eyes. It reminded him of soldiers he had served with before important missions. An hour later they reached the hidden entrance. The metal door stood partially concealed by rocks and brush. In daylight, it looked even older than Ethan remembered. Rust covered much of the surface. Moss crept along the edges. Frank approached slowly. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the cold metal. "I never thought I'd see this place again," he said. Ethan waited. Frank took a long breath. "After the rescue mission, a few of us stored materials here. Evidence, notes. Things we didn't trust the military to protect." Ethan's pulse quickened. Together they forced the heavy door open. The hinges groaned loudly. A narrow concrete stairway descended into darkness. The air inside smelled of dust and age. Ethan switched on a flashlight while Shadow moved ahead carefully. The old dog seemed strangely familiar with the place, despite never being there before. The bunker itself was larger than expected. Several rooms branched from a central corridor. Old shelves lined the walls. Metal cabinets sat beneath layers of dust. Most appeared untouched for years. As they explored, Ethan noticed military markings faded by time. This had once been a temporary emergency shelter used during training operations. In the first room they found old communication equipment. Most of it no longer worked. The second room contained storage crates filled with maps, uniforms, and field supplies. But the third room changed everything. Against one wall stood a locked steel cabinet. Frank stared at it silently. "That wasn't here before," he whispered. Ethan forced the cabinet open. Inside were dozens of folders sealed in waterproof containers. Beneath them sat photo albums and several notebooks. Frank carefully opened the first folder. The pages inside contained mission reports. Original mission reports. Not the altered versions described in official records. Ethan quickly realized what they were seeing. Every document identified Frank Dawson and several other soldiers as leaders of the rescue operation. Detailed timelines described the mission step by step. Witness statements confirmed that Colonel Halstead had remained at base while Frank and his team entered hostile territory to save the survivors. The evidence was overwhelming. For years, the truth had remained hidden beneath a mountain. Frank sat down heavily. His eyes never left the pages. Ethan could see emotions moving across the old veteran's face. Relief, sadness, anger, validation. More than 30 years of silence seemed to press against him all at once. "We weren't crazy," Frank murmured. "We remembered it correctly." Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. Neither man spoke for several moments. Then Shadow began scratching at another cabinet near the back wall. Ethan investigated and discovered several old journals stacked inside a waterproof container. Most belonged to members of the rescue team. One name immediately caught his attention: Samuel Price. Frank looked surprised. Sam was our medic. Ethan opened the first journal. The handwriting remained clear despite its age. Samuel Price had apparently documented much of the deployment. Several entries described daily life during the mission. Others recorded conversations between soldiers. The notebooks appeared remarkably detailed. Later that afternoon, Ethan carried several journals back to town and stopped at Emily Carter's veterinary clinic. Emily listened carefully as he explained their discovery. Her eyes widened when she saw the notebooks. Emily had always enjoyed local history. More importantly, she possessed the patience required to study old documents. Together they began reading through the journals. Samuel Price emerged as a fascinating figure. He had been 34 during the mission. According to his writings, he was known for remaining calm under pressure. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother in an accident, a tragedy that influenced his decision to become a combat medic. He believed every life deserved a chance. As Emily continued reading, she uncovered information that filled several missing gaps. Samuel described how Frank repeatedly risked his life to rescue injured personnel. Several entries directly contradicted the official military reports. One passage described Frank carrying wounded survivors across dangerous terrain after extraction helicopters were delayed. Another mentioned Colonel Halstead refusing to approve rescue efforts until public relations concerns were addressed. Emily looked up from the journal. These entries support everything Frank told us. Ethan nodded. And they're written by someone with no reason to lie. They spent hours organizing notes. By evening, they had assembled a timeline far more complete than anything Frank previously possessed. Meanwhile, back at the bunker, Frank continued examining documents. The experience stirred powerful memories, some painful, some comforting. For the first time in decades, he felt as though the men who served beside him had not been forgotten. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the files. Men who had died years ago. Men whose families never learned the full truth. Frank quietly promised himself he would change that if given the opportunity. As darkness settled over Silver Creek, another meeting took place several miles away. Richard Coleman sat inside a private office overlooking one of his construction sites. The wealthy businessman appeared calm on the surface. He was a man accustomed to control, but recent events had begun to disturb him. Across the desk sat Victor Crane, a former security contractor in his 50s. Victor possessed a hard face and few moral concerns. Years of working dangerous jobs had made him practical rather than loyal. Richard slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Frank Dawson standing beside Ethan in shadow. The old man found something, Richard said quietly. Victor studied the image. You want it recovered? Richard's expression hardened. I want every document connected to that mission gone. Victor nodded. For enough money, he rarely asked questions. The following night, Ethan, Frank, and Emily gathered inside the cabin to review their findings. Shadow slept near the fireplace, exhausted after 2 days of constant activity. The atmosphere felt hopeful for the first time since the investigation began. They finally possessed proof, real proof. Then a sound interrupted the conversation. A faint noise outside. Shadow's head lifted instantly. The old German shepherd moved to the window. A low growl emerged from his throat. Ethan stood. Years of military training returned immediately. Through the darkness he noticed movement near the truck parked outside. Someone was there. By the time he reached the door, the figure had vanished into the forest. Ethan rushed outside but found only fresh footprints in the mud. When he returned, Frank's face had gone pale. One glance at the table told them why. Several folders were missing. Someone had entered the cabin while they were distracted. The hunt for the evidence had begun. A sharp wind swept across the mountains outside Silver Creek, carrying loose snow through the pine-covered slopes. Winter refused to leave quietly. Although patches of green had begun to appear in lower valleys, the higher elevations remained trapped beneath ice and snow. The morning after the break, Ethan Walker stood outside Frank Dawson's cabin studying the footprints left behind in the mud. The thief had moved quickly. Several tracks led toward the forest before disappearing beneath a layer of fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Most people would have considered the trail lost. Shadow did not. The old German shepherd stood beside Ethan with his nose close to the ground. Despite the injury he had suffered months earlier and the scars hidden beneath his fur, the dog remained determined. His amber eyes never stopped searching. Ethan clipped a tracking leash onto Shadow's collar and knelt beside him. "Can you find them?" he asked quietly. Shadow responded by pulling forward. That was answer enough. Inside the cabin, Frank sat at the kitchen table holding one of Samuel Price's journals. He had barely slept. The missing documents had reopened wounds, he thought. Time had buried. For decades he had convinced himself that the past no longer mattered. Yet now, with the truth finally within reach, losing the evidence felt unbearable. Emily Carter sat across from him. The veterinarian had stayed overnight after the break. She knew Frank needed support, even if he rarely asked for it. "You don't have to go," she said gently when Ethan prepared to leave. Frank shook his head. "I do." The old veteran slowly stood. His hip still bothered him, but determination outweighed discomfort. "Those papers aren't just mine," he said. "They belong to every man who was there." 2 hours later, Ethan, Frank, Emily, and Shadow followed the trail deeper into the mountains. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Snow covered sections of the path while fallen branches blocked others. Several times Ethan helped Frank navigate steep slopes. Despite his age, Frank refused to complain. The closer they moved toward the unknown destination, the more focused he became. Along the way, memories surfaced that he had spent years avoiding. At one point, they stopped near a frozen stream. Frank stared at the water for a long moment before speaking. "There was a soldier named Aaron Mills," he said quietly. Neither Ethan nor Emily interrupted. Frank rarely volunteered stories. He was 22, youngest member of the rescue team. Frank's voice softened. He used to carry photographs of his daughter everywhere. Ethan listened carefully. Aaron Mills had been one of the soldiers involved in the operation that changed Frank's life. During the extraction, Aaron stayed behind to secure a landing zone while civilians boarded a helicopter. He survived the mission but later died during another deployment. Frank had always blamed himself. "I promised his wife I'd visit after the war," Frank continued. "I never did." Emily could see the guilt written across his face. Some wounds survived decades. "You were carrying too much yourself," she said. Frank offered a weak smile. "Maybe, or maybe I was just afraid." The group continued forward around midday. Shadow suddenly became more alert. His pace increased. The dog pulled hard enough to force Ethan into a near jog. Something was close. Very close. The trail eventually led toward a remote section of the mountain where abandoned logging roads twisted between dense forests. There they found fresh tire tracks. Ethan crouched beside them. They passed through recently. Shadow continued moving, another mile ahead. The group discovered an old hunting cabin hidden among the trees. Smoke drifted from a chimney. Someone was inside. Ethan immediately signaled everyone to stay back. Years of military training returned instinctively. He studied the area through binoculars. A black pickup truck sat beside the cabin. Nearby stood a tall man wearing a dark jacket. Ethan recognized him from photographs Frank had recovered. Victor Crane, the security contractor hired by Richard Coleman. Victor appeared to be loading boxes into the truck. Ethan's jaw tightened. They had found their thief. Unfortunately, Victor spotted them almost at the same moment. The man froze briefly before rushing toward the driver's side door. "Move!" Ethan shouted. Victor climbed into the truck and accelerated immediately. Tires spun across the snow. Ethan sprinted forward with Shadow racing beside him. The chase began. The truck bounced along the narrow mountain road, throwing snow behind it. Ethan and Shadow followed as quickly as possible while Frank and Emily remained safely behind. Victor's escape route twisted through steep terrain. Several times the truck nearly lost control, yet Shadow continued tracking relentlessly. Ethan managed to cut across portions of the forest, using his knowledge of mountain navigation to stay close. Eventually the road narrowed beside a rocky cliff. Victor attempted a sharp turn. The truck skidded. One wheel slid off the road and became trapped. Ethan saw his opportunity. Victor abandoned the vehicle and grabbed a heavy duffel bag before running into the trees. Shadow immediately pursued. The German Shepherd moved with surprising speed for his age. Ethan followed seconds behind. The forest became a maze of snow, covered rocks and fallen timber. Victor crashed through the brush ahead while Shadow gained ground. Finally, the contractor stumbled while crossing a frozen creek. The duffel bag slipped from his shoulder and landed in the snow. Victor turned, pulling out a metal pipe he had grabbed from the truck. "Stay back," he shouted. Shadow ignored the warning. The old dog launched forward. Victor swung the pipe. Ethan saw the strike connect. A painful yelp echoed through the forest. Shadow crashed into the snow. Rage surged through Ethan. Before Victor could react again, Ethan tackled him. The two men hit the ground hard. Years of military experience quickly ended the struggle. Moments later, Victor lay restrained with his hands secured behind his back. Ethan immediately turned toward Shadow. The German shepherd struggled to stand. Blood stained part of his shoulder where the pipe had struck him. Despite the injury, Shadow limped toward the fallen duffel bag. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside were the missing documents, mission reports, photographs, witness statements, everything Victor had stolen. The evidence was intact. Relief flooded through Ethan, but his attention quickly returned to Shadow. The dog sat beside the recovered bag, breathing heavily. His shoulder injury looked painful, yet his eyes remained fixed on the documents as though protecting them still mattered more than protecting himself. When Frank and Emily finally arrived, they found Ethan kneeling beside the German shepherd. Frank's eyes filled with emotion. Shadow had once again saved more than evidence. He had protected the truth. Emily immediately examined the injury. "He'll recover," she said, "but he's going to need rest." Frank gently placed a hand on Shadow's head. The old veteran looked down at the recovered bag and then back at the dog. For several moments he could not speak. Around them, snow drifted quietly through the mountains. The chase was over. The evidence had been recovered, but as Ethan looked toward the distant horizon, he knew the real battle was only beginning. Richard Coleman would not stop simply because one plan had failed. Spring finally began to touch the mountains around Silver Creek. The snow still covered the highest ridges, but lower valleys were turning green again. Streams ran freely beneath the pines, carrying melted snow toward distant rivers. For the first time in months, sunlight lingered longer over the town. Yet inside Frank Dawson's cabin, nobody paid much attention to the changing season. The recovered evidence spread across the dining table demanded all their focus. Ethan Walker spent several days organizing documents, photographs, witness statements, and pages from Samuel Price's journals. Emily Carter helped sort materials into categories, while Frank carefully reviewed records he had not seen in more than 3 decades. Shadow remained close to the table throughout the process. His shoulder was healing, though a bandage still covered part of the injury left by Victor Crane's attack. The old German shepherd moved more slowly than before, but his spirit remained unchanged. Whenever Frank left the room, Shadow followed. Whenever Ethan worked late into the night, Shadow stayed nearby. It was as if the dog understood the importance of what was happening. One afternoon, Ethan finished assembling digital copies of every document. Nothing would be stored in a single place again. Too much had already been lost. "This time," Ethan said, looking at Frank, "if somebody wants to bury the truth, they'll have to erase half the state." Frank managed a faint smile. The old veteran looked healthier than he had weeks earlier, but a certain nervousness remained. For decades he had accepted that nobody would ever know what really happened during the Gulf War rescue mission. Now the possibility of public recognition felt almost overwhelming. Emily noticed his uneasiness. "You're worried," she said. Frank stared at a photograph showing younger members of the rescue team. "I've spent 30 years being forgotten," he replied quietly. "Part of me learned how to live that way." Before anyone could answer, Shadow rested his head against Frank's knee. The old veteran smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. Sometimes animals understood things better than people. The following week, Ethan traveled to Helena to meet military investigators assigned to review the case. The investigation had officially reopened after copies of the evidence reached several government offices and journalists. Among the investigators was Major Claire Benson, a woman in her early 40s who had spent years examining historical military records. Claire possessed a reputation for honesty that occasionally caused problems with superiors. Early in her career, she exposed inaccuracies in a decorated officer's service record, a decision that earned both criticism and respect. After reviewing the evidence, Claire appeared stunned. "I've seen cases with missing pieces before," she admitted. "I've never seen this many pieces hidden intentionally." Ethan handed her another folder. "Then you understand why this matters." Claire nodded. "More than you know." The investigation quickly gained momentum. Several retired personnel identified in Samuel Price's journals were located and interviewed. One of them was Walter Pierce, the former helicopter pilot Frank had mentioned months earlier. Walter was now 72 years old and living on a small ranch in Wyoming. Years of isolation had made him cautious, but once investigators showed him the recovered evidence, he agreed to speak. His testimony matched Frank's version of events almost perfectly. Another former service member, James Rutledge, provided copies of personal notes he had kept since the mission. Each new witness strengthened the case. Meanwhile, journalists began asking questions. Articles appeared in local newspapers. Then regional television stations picked up the story. Before long, people throughout Montana were discussing Frank Dawson. Many had never heard his name before. Others recognized him as the quiet veteran who lived alone in the mountains. Few could believe that a forgotten rescue mission might finally receive the recognition it deserved after so many years. The attention made Frank uncomfortable at first, yet something unexpected happened. Veterans began reaching out to him. Some arrived at the Veterans Center after hearing his story online. Others wrote letters. Many simply wanted someone who understood. One evening, Frank returned to the center where he had previously shared his memories. This time, nearly twice as many people attended. Among them was Nathan Briggs, a former Army engineer in his late 20s. Nathan had struggled since returning from deployment overseas. After losing a close friend during a construction accident, he withdrew from family and friends. Frank's story inspired him to attend the meeting. Also present was Maria Santos, a former military nurse in her 30s. Years of caring for wounded soldiers had left emotional scars she rarely discussed. She listened carefully as Frank spoke. Unlike previous meetings, Frank no longer focused entirely on the past. Instead, he spoke about healing, about second chances, about the danger of carrying pain alone for too long. "The war ended decades ago for me," he told the room, "but I kept fighting it inside my head every day." Silence filled the hall. Many understood exactly what he meant. Nathan Briggs eventually stood and shared part of his own experience. Then Maria spoke, others followed. For the first time in years, some of those veterans felt less isolated. The effect spread throughout Silver Creek. Local businesses began supporting veteran center programs. Donations increased. Volunteers offered services. What started as an investigation into an old military injustice gradually became something larger. It became a story about people finding their way back to one another. Ethan noticed the change most clearly in Frank himself. The old veteran laughed more often. He spent less time staring into the fireplace and more time speaking with visitors. Even Shadow seemed happier. The dog enjoyed the increased attention and often served as an unofficial greeter whenever veterans arrived. Emily joked that Shadow had become more popular than anyone else in town. Yet despite the positive developments, uncertainty remained. Richard Coleman had become unusually quiet. No public statements, no interviews, no visible response to the growing investigation. Ethan distrusted silence more than open hostility. It often meant someone was planning something. Several weeks later, Major Claire Benson called with important news. Additional military archives had been unlocked. Internal communications recovered from storage showed evidence that portions of the original mission report had indeed been altered after the operation. The findings represented a major breakthrough. "We're getting closer," Claire told Ethan. "Much closer." That evening the group gathered at Frank's cabin to celebrate. Nothing official had happened yet, but for the first time success felt possible. As sunset painted the mountains gold, Frank stepped onto the porch with Shadow beside him. The old veteran watched the valley below. Cars moved through town, smoke rose from chimneys. Life continued as it always had. Yet somehow everything felt different. A few minutes later, Ethan emerged from the cabin carrying the day's mail. Most of it consisted of letters from veterans and reporters. Then he noticed one envelope unlike the others. The return address immediately caught his attention. Washington, D.C. Department of Defense. Ethan stared at it for a moment before handing it to Frank. The old veteran looked confused. Slowly, he turned the envelope over in his hands. Shadow sat beside him, watching quietly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The mountain air felt suddenly still. Frank looked at Ethan, then at Emily, then back at the official seal printed across the envelope. After 30 years of silence, the government had finally written back. The mountains surrounding Silver Creek glowed beneath the gentle warmth of late spring. Snow remained only on the highest peaks now, while the valleys below had transformed into fields of green grass and wildflowers. The long winter that had brought Shadow to Ethan Walker's doorstep felt distant, almost unreal. Yet the events set in motion that snowy night had changed the lives of everyone involved. On a quiet morning, Frank Dawson stood on the porch of his cabin holding the letter from the Department of Defense. He had read it dozens of times already, but the words still felt impossible. The investigation had concluded. The evidence recovered from the bunker, Samuel Price's journals, witness testimonies, and newly uncovered military records, all pointed to the same conclusion. Frank Dawson and his rescue team had been the true heroes of the operation. Official military history would be corrected. For 30 years Frank had lived with silence. Now the truth was finally speaking for itself. Shadow sat beside him, watching birds move between the pine trees. The old German shepherd had recovered well from his shoulder injury. Age had slowed him, but not diminished him. Ethan often joked that Shadow had the soul of a stubborn sergeant trapped inside a dog. Frank smiled and rested a hand on the dog's head. "Looks like you finished your mission, old boy," he whispered. A few days later, Silver Creek prepared for an event unlike any it had hosted in decades. The town square was decorated with flags. Local veterans organized displays. Families gathered along the streets. News crews arrived from neighboring counties. Even people who had never served understood that something important was happening. Among the visitors was Colonel Susan Keller, a senior military representative assigned to present the official recognition. Susan was a woman in her 50s whose father had served during Vietnam. Growing up around veterans taught her deep respect for military service and a strong dislike for injustice. When she reviewed Frank's case, she personally requested permission to attend the ceremony. Ethan arrived early that morning, standing in front of a mirror inside his cabin. He adjusted the collar of a clean shirt he rarely wore. For years he had avoided public gatherings whenever possible. Yet this day felt different. Looking outside, he noticed Shadow waiting near the truck. The dog appeared unusually calm, as though he somehow understood where they were going. During the drive into town, Ethan found himself thinking about Michael Reed. The memories came more often lately, but something had changed. The pain remained, yet it no longer felt like a chain around his neck. Over the past months, listening to Frank share his regrets and struggles had forced Ethan to confront his own. He remembered the day Michael died. For years he replayed every decision, every movement, every second. He convinced himself that if he had acted differently, Michael would still be alive. But Frank had told him something during one of their late-night conversations. "You honor the dead by living well," the old veteran had said, "not by punishing yourself forever." Ethan finally understood what that meant. The ceremony began shortly before noon. Hundreds of people gathered around the town square. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder. Families filled folding chairs. Children waved small American flags. Frank looked uncomfortable as he approached the stage. He had spent decades avoiding attention. Now an entire town watched him. Shadow walked beside him, drawing smiles from the crowd. Several people recognized the dog immediately. Stories about Shadow's journey had spread almost as widely as Frank's. When Colonel Susan Keller stepped to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. She spoke about courage, about service, about truth. Then she described the rescue mission that had remained hidden for more than 30 years. Many listeners were visibly moved. Some veterans nodded quietly as she spoke. They understood better than anyone how easily sacrifices could disappear into forgotten paperwork. Finally, Susan called Frank forward. The old veteran walked slowly to the center of the stage. For a moment he simply stood there. The applause seemed almost overwhelming. Then Colonel Keller presented the medal and official citation that should have been awarded decades earlier. Frank accepted it with trembling hands. Tears filled his eyes. He looked toward the crowd. For a moment he appeared unable to speak. Then he took a deep breath. "This medal belongs to more than me," he said. His voice cracked slightly. "It belongs to the men who stood beside me. Some are gone now. Some never got to see this day." The crowd remained silent. Frank continued. "I spent years believing the truth didn't matter anymore. I was wrong. Not because of the medal, not because of recognition, because every person deserves to know their sacrifice meant something." Applause erupted again. Ethan found himself clapping harder than anyone. Beside him, Emily Carter smiled. Over the past months, she and Ethan had grown closer without either of them fully realizing it. Their conversations became longer. Their silences became more comfortable. What began as cooperation gradually became friendship, and friendship was slowly becoming something more. After the ceremony ended, the crowd gathered around Frank. Reporters requested interviews. Veterans shook his hand. Families thanked him. Yet somehow Frank still found time to sit beneath a tree near the edge of the square. Shadow immediately joined him. Ethan and Emily soon followed. "Quite a day," Emily said. Frank laughed softly. "More excitement than I've had in 30 years. The three sat together watching the celebration continue. Nearby, children played with Shadow. The old dog tolerated the attention with remarkable patience. Ethan noticed how peaceful everything felt. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't reliving Afghanistan. He wasn't questioning every decision he had made. He simply existed in the moment. Emily glanced toward him. "You seem lighter," Ethan smiled. "Maybe I finally stopped carrying things that weren't mine to carry." Emily understood immediately. No further explanation was necessary. As the afternoon sun lowered toward the mountains, the crowd gradually dispersed. Frank remained seated beneath the tree. The medal rested in his lap. Eventually he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small object wrapped in cloth. "Ethan," he said. Ethan looked over. Frank carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside rested an old military badge worn smooth by time. The insignia belonged to the rescue unit Frank had served with decades earlier. "This stayed with me through everything," Frank said. "The war, the lies, the years after." Ethan immediately shook his head. "Frank, I can't take that." "Yes, you can." The old veteran smiled. "Because the mission isn't over." Ethan stared at the badge. "What mission?" Frank looked toward Shadow, then toward the Veterans Center visible across town, helping people find their way home. For several moments, Ethan said nothing. Then he accepted the badge. The medal felt surprisingly heavy in his hand. Not because of its weight, but because of everything it represented. Frank leaned back in his chair. Shadow rested at his feet. The old veteran watched the town around him and smiled. After 30 years, honor had finally found its way back home. The summer sun rose gently over the mountains surrounding Silver Creek. The long winter storms were gone, replaced by green hillsides, wildflowers, and clear blue skies stretching beyond the horizon. Birds nested among the pines, streams sparkled beneath the morning light, and the valley seemed filled with the quiet promise of new beginnings. Nearly a year had passed since a starving German shepherd had appeared at Ethan Walker's cabin during a snowstorm. What had begun as a mystery had become something none of them could have imagined. Frank Dawson stood at the edge of a wide field overlooking his property. The old veteran leaned on a wooden cane, not because he needed it every day, but because age occasionally reminded him that time moved forward whether people were ready or not. Beside him stood Ethan Walker and Emily Carter. Construction crews moved across the property below. New buildings were taking shape where empty land had once stretched toward the forest. Frank smiled as he watched workers raise the final beams of the largest structure. "I spent 30 years hiding from the world," he said quietly. "Seems only fair to spend whatever time I have left opening a door instead." Several months earlier, after receiving official recognition from the military, Frank had made a decision that surprised everyone. He donated most of his land to create a veteran support center, unlike anything Silver Creek had ever seen. The facility would provide counseling, temporary housing, community programs, and a special training program pairing struggling veterans with therapy dogs. Frank believed many soldiers needed purpose as much as they needed treatment. He knew because he had spent years searching for both himself. The project quickly gained support. Donations arrived from across Montana. Local businesses contributed supplies. Veterans volunteered their time. Families offered equipment. What began as a small dream soon became a community effort. The center would be called the Home of the Found. Frank chose the name himself, because too many people spend years feeling lost, he explained during one town meeting. This place exists so they can find their way back. Ethan eventually left his isolated cabin and moved into a small house near the property. For the first time in years, he no longer woke each morning wondering what his purpose was. He helped oversee daily operations, coordinated veteran outreach programs, and mentored former service members struggling to rebuild their lives. Some days involved paperwork, other days involved listening. Ethan discovered that listening often mattered more. Emily became equally involved. While continuing her veterinary work, she developed the therapy dog program that would become the heart of the center. She worked closely with trainers, volunteers, and local shelters. Under her guidance, several rescue dogs found new homes, while helping veterans heal from trauma. The work brought out a side of Emily that Ethan admired deeply. She possessed a quiet determination that never demanded attention yet inspired everyone around her. Their friendship gradually grew into something stronger. Neither rushed it. Life had taught both of them patience. The people around them noticed long before they did. Shadow became the unofficial symbol of the entire project. Visitors arriving at the center often saw the old German shepherd resting beneath a tree near the entrance, or slowly walking alongside veterans exploring the grounds. His story spread far beyond Silver Creek. Newspapers published articles about him. Veterans organizations invited Frank to speak about him. Children drew pictures of him. Someone even donated a bronze plaque featuring Shadow's likeness. The inscription beneath it read, "He never stopped looking for the way home." Despite his age, Shadow seemed happiest when surrounded by people. Many veterans connected with him immediately. They understood scars. They understood loss. They understood survival. Among those who arrived at the center was Marcus Hill, a former Army Ranger in his late 30s. Marcus struggled after losing part of his hearing during an explosion overseas. The injury ended his military career and left him feeling disconnected from the life he once knew. At first, he rarely spoke. Then Shadow started sitting beside him during group meetings. Gradually, Marcus opened up. Months later, he became one of the center's most dedicated volunteers. Another veteran was Olivia Turner, a former military intelligence analyst in her early 40s. Years of stressful deployments and personal losses had caused her to isolate herself from family and friends. She arrived at the center skeptical and withdrawn, but after working with a rescued Labrador named Daisy, she slowly began reconnecting with people again. Stories like theirs became common. Every week new faces arrived carrying invisible burdens. Every week some of those burdens became lighter. Frank often spent afternoons sitting beneath a large oak tree near the training field. Veterans gathered around him to hear stories from the Gulf War, lessons about resilience, or simply tales about mistakes he had made throughout his life. Unlike before, he no longer spoke about the past with bitterness. The years had taught him something important. Pain shared honestly could become wisdom. Young veterans listened carefully. Local students occasionally visited. Even town residents stopped by just to talk. Frank had become something unexpected, a storyteller whose experiences helped others navigate their own struggles. One evening Ethan found him sitting alone watching the sunset. "You've changed," Ethan said. Frank chuckled. "At 79, that's supposed to stop happening." Ethan smiled. "Not that kind of change." The old veteran looked toward the fields where veterans and dogs trained together. "For years I thought my life was defined by what was taken from me," he admitted. "Turns out it was defined by what I still had left to give." Ethan understood exactly what he meant. The same lesson had transformed his own life. Michael Reed's memory no longer haunted him. It accompanied him instead. The guilt that once consumed him had slowly been replaced by gratitude. He finally accepted that honoring his friend meant living fully, rather than remaining trapped in regret. As summer turned toward autumn, the center officially opened. Hundreds attended the ceremony. Veterans stood beside families. Dogs ran across open fields. Children laughed. Volunteers guided visitors through the buildings. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic announcements, just people coming together for something meaningful. Months later, on a peaceful spring afternoon, the place felt exactly as Frank had hoped. Ethan, Emily, Frank, and Shadow sat together on the wide front porch overlooking the property. Across the fields, veterans trained with therapy dogs. Others worked in gardens. Some simply sat together talking beneath the trees. Laughter drifted through the air. The setting sun painted the Montana sky with shades of gold and orange. Shadow lay comfortably at Frank's feet. His muzzle had grown whiter. His movements were slower now, but his eyes remained calm and content. Frank watched the scene for a long time before speaking. "Maybe God doesn't send angels with wings," he said softly. "Maybe sometimes he sends a loyal dog." No one answered immediately. None of them needed to. The truth of those words surrounded them. Ethan looked toward Emily. Emily smiled back. Frank rested a hand on Shadow's head. Beyond them, the center continued to thrive. Veterans who once felt forgotten had found purpose. Dogs who once needed homes had found families. Strangers had become friends. Friends had become family. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the mountains. Shadow closed his eyes beside the people he loved most. No one was forgotten anymore. No one had to fight alone. And this time, every one of them had finally found the road home. As this story comes to an end, perhaps the greatest miracle was never the lost documents, the long-hidden truth, or even the honor that finally returned after 30 years. Perhaps the real miracle was that broken hearts found one another at exactly the right moment. A lonely veteran found a faithful dog found his way home. Old wounds began to heal, and people who believed they had been forgotten discovered that they still mattered. Sometimes God works in ways we do not immediately understand. He may not send miracles wrapped in bright light or dramatic signs. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog to knock on a door. Sometimes he places the right person on our path. Sometimes he reminds us that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and no sacrifice is truly forgotten. In our everyday lives, many people around us may be carrying silent battles that nobody else can see. A neighbor, a friend, a veteran, or even a family member may simply need someone willing to listen, care, and stay beside them through difficult times. Let this story remind us that hope can return when we least expect it, that healing is possible even after years of pain, and that God's timing is often greater than our understanding. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Share this story with someone who may need a little hope today. And if you enjoy stories about faith, courage, second chances, and the incredible bond between people and animals, please subscribe to the channel. and join our growing community. May God bless you and your family with peace, good health, strength, and love. May He guide your steps, protect your loved ones, and remind you every day that you are never truly alone. Thank you for watching, and may God's grace be with you always.